Your point, Tony, about the prevention versus response, of how the options really narrow after atrocities or conflict begins, is very appreciated. But I do want to, I mean, those are the cases that really focus the mind, that focus government attention. And I think I'd like to talk for a few minutes about the case of Syria. So in the course of the 2-year civil war, I think these numbers are right. We've had about at least 70,000 civilian deaths. Many of those people have died, non-combatants, part of massacres, atrocities. We had last night at our dinner, we had the UN High Commissioner for Refugees who told me personally of just the incredible displacement that's going on. We have now some 2 million people displaced, either internally or refugees. And I mean, this is an atrocity that is happening in slow motion before our eyes. Why, in this case, do you think the international community is so paralyzed to act? And do you think, now we have reports that Assad may have used or did use chemical weapons, which makes it even more dangerous. What are your thoughts about, number one, why it's been so difficult for the world to act in a preventive way when everyone agrees, as you say, that prevention would be better? And then number two, what might be some concrete steps forward?
So let's talk about Syria, but just before we do, I do want to point to a couple of instances where we actually have been able to act preventively. And it's one of those things that it's a little bit hard to prove what would have happened had we not acted. We don't know, but we can imagine. And so, for example, over a year ago in Sudan, we were on the eve of a referendum for the creation of South Sudan, and it was an extraordinarily fragile situation that threatened to revert back to a civil war that had claimed hundreds of thousands, or by some counts, far more lives. And we engaged very intensely, starting with the president, galvanizing the international community to get behind the referendum, to make sure that the parties stood behind it and that they let it go forward. And it did go forward. And as imperfect as the situation is, we have the creation of a new state, South Sudan. We're in a far better place than we were. And again, you can't say what would have happened had we not engaged, but I'd like to think that we acted in a preventive way. Cote d'Ivoire is another example where you had a president who lost an election, insisted on hanging on to power, threatened violence, and everything was in place for a significant conflict and significant atrocities. Again, there too, we engaged with international partners. The United Nations and its peacekeeping effort did a very effective job. And as a result, the losing president left the country. He's now in The Hague. And we have a return to democracy. And then, of course, Libya, where Gaddafi was threatening Benghazi, tens of thousands of lives were at risk, and the United States, with other countries, led the effort to prevent what would have been, and I profoundly believe would have been, a horrific slaughter. We marshaled the United Nations. We used our unique military assets to help other countries use theirs. And the result is, as difficult as Libya is today, I believe we prevented a terrible atrocity there as well. But Syria is, I think, for all of us, a tremendous frustration. Let's be clear, though. We haven't done nothing. We've done a lot, but we obviously haven't done enough to change the facts on the ground. When the crisis in Syria began, and in particular, when Assad turned on his own people, we began to play a lead role in trying to bring the international community together to do something about it. And we've taken a number of steps that are not insignificant. We've worked very hard to isolate the Syrian government and the Assad regime, economically and politically. The sanctions that have been applied are starving the regime of money, making it more difficult to buy off those whose support it needs. Isolated politically around the world, with dozens of countries joining a coalition to isolate the Syrian government. At the same time, we've worked very hard to build up the opposition, to make it credible, to give it tools, to make it more effective. It's incredibly slow. It's difficult work in progress, but it is happening. Just a week ago, Secretary Kerry was in Istanbul and announced a doubling of our assistance to the civilian opposition, and also, for the first time, significant assistance to the military component of the opposition, including non-lethal but nonetheless important items that would support them in combat, things like protective gear, body armor, night vision goggles, and so forth. So we've done that to try to make them more effective. Third, the United States is and remains by far the largest humanitarian donor to Syria in this time of need. As Mike, you said, this crisis internally and externally is reaching extraordinary proportions. By the estimate of the United Nations, about 6.5 million people are in need within Syria. And refugees, including especially in Jordan, in Turkey, in Lebanon, and to some extent Iraq, not only are facing terrible situations for themselves, but are beginning to have a very difficult impact on the countries that are good enough to host them. But we're working to take a lead role in trying to do something about that. And we're also trying to prepare for the day after Assad, including making sure that the chemical weapons that are all too present in Syria are accounted for and secured, and trying to keep the state together. And finally, where we've been trying to drive this, and we obviously haven't succeeded to date, but let me explain what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it. We've been trying to drive this toward a political transition where Assad and the regime give up power, transition it to some kind of authority, and ultimately elections are held and a democratic government takes over. Why is this so important? Because absent that kind of managed transition, it's very likely that the state will fall apart, that its institutions will fall apart, and that the fragmentation results in a failed state that becomes home to extremist groups, in which chemical weapons are floating around and getting into the wrong hands, and in which people are suffering. And so we put a tremendous diplomatic effort in trying to bring people together toward the solution, and obviously we haven't gotten there yet. So that's what we're trying to do. But meanwhile, Michael, as you said, tens of thousands of people have been killed, and now millions of people are in dire need. And it's a very unsatisfying place to be. It's something that preoccupies all of us, that we're working on every single day. I think you asked, why is it so hard? There's another factor. We spent in the United States the last decade plus engaged in 2 wars. And we spent the last 4 years working to get out of those wars. We ended the war in Iraq. We're on a glide path to end the war in Afghanistan. There is, understandably, a profound caution in taking steps that could possibly engage the United States again in another conflict, particularly in that part of the world. And so the President is working on this in a way that is very deliberate, very focused, and my hope is we're able to move Syria to a better place in the coming months. Let me just cite one quick example of where a managed transition of this kind has actually worked better than I think anyone anticipated, and that's in Yemen, where very much what we're trying to do in Syria has actually happened and has made life a lot better. So that's what we're working on. I hope that the next time we get together, we have a better story to tell.